Hi, I'm Realtor Ben, and in this video we'll compare living in Orlando, Florida versus living on the Space Coast. Having lived both in Orlando and on the Space Coast, I'll compare the most important factors of living, like the cost of living, income, schools, and of course real estate. And we'll start right off with the cost of living. Currently in Orlando, the cost of living is 104.1, with 100 being the national average. On the Space Coast, it's currently 94.1, so overall the cost of living is 10% cheaper on the Space Coast, hence this one goes to the Space Coast. Alright, next up is entertainment. While the Space Coast has lots of restaurants, bars, shopping, Port Canaveral, of course the beaches and the Kennedy Space Center, obviously no place can compete with Orlando and all the theme parks and tourist attraction they got there. However, from my own personal experience, my wife and I were both huge theme park fans, and living both in Orlando and on the Space Coast, we found that we go just as often as before. We have annual passes for Disney and Universal, and we usually go every other week. And since the distance to Orlando from the Space Coast isn't very far, it's not really a big deal breaker. However, obviously, this badge goes to Orlando. Now, with all those theme parks in Orlando come 75 million people driving the streets of Orlando, and that brings us to transportation. A quick look at the cost of transportation: gas prices, maintenance, repairs, and insurance are about 22% higher in Orlando compared to the Space Coast. But even though that's a huge difference, the most alarming factor is the traffic in Orlando. Commuters in Orlando spend an average of 57 hours per year stuck in traffic. The rate of deadly traffic accidents in the Orlando area is more than double compared to the Space Coast, and making Orlando's county the deadliest in Florida for driving. Orlando's main highway, I-4, was named the most dangerous American highway, with an average of 1.25 deaths per mile, and the Orlando section of I-4 in particular is reported to be the deadliest section, with the maximum number of deaths occurring there. So between 75 million tourists who are not familiar with the area and local road rage, it's easy to understand why Orlando was rated the number 6 most stressful city in the United States, so transportation goes without any doubt to the Space Coast. Alright, next up is real estate. Currently the housing index in Orlando is 106.1 compared to 91.1 on the Space Coast, making it significantly more affordable to live on the Space Coast. The median home price in Orlando is a little over $245,000, while the median home price on the Space Coast is a little over $210,000. Now let me give you a better idea of the real estate market here by comparing a neighborhood in Orlando and a neighborhood on the Space Coast. To make it more comparable, I've chosen Lake Nona in Orlando and Viera on the Space Coast because they're both master planned communities, which are both consistently ranked in the top 25 communities in the United States. These two neighborhoods are almost identical, being guard-gated, offering resort and lap pools, tennis courts, ballrooms, state-of-the-art fitness centers, and much more, so they really are as close as it gets. Now, for a 3-bedroom home, you pay a little over $399,000 in the Orlando neighborhood and a little over $324,000 in the Space Coast neighborhood. So you're actually paying over 20% more to live in an almost identical neighborhood. So real estate obviously goes to the Space Coast. And before we look into schools, income, and healthcare, please hit the like button if you want to see more videos like this. Now let's get into schools. Over the past 3 years, the Orlando schools have gotten an ABB rating, while the Space Coast got a AAA rating. There's on average 1 to 2 more students per teacher in Orlando, and there's almost twice as many students per counselor in the Orlando area. So the overall quality of schools is better in the Space Coast, hence this one goes to the Space Coast as well. Alright, now let's get into income. The family median income in Orlando is a little over $50,000, while it's a little over $63,000 on the Space Coast. That is probably due because a lot of jobs in Orlando are related to the tourist and entertainment sector, which doesn't offer as many management positions. So with the family median income being over 22% higher on the Space Coast is the clear winner for income. And finally, let's look into healthcare. The cost for healthcare in Orlando is only 2.8% higher than on the Space Coast, and the amount of physicians per capita is also very close. However, where they differ greatly is the air quality. The air quality on the Space Coast is significantly better than in Orlando, which is most likely due to all the beaches, the Indian River running through the Space Coast, and the large amount of wildlife sanctuaries. So looking at the final score of living in Orlando, Florida versus living on the Space Coast, with its beautiful beaches, great schools, significantly lower real estate prices, yet just 45 minutes away from Orlando, the Space Coast is the clear winner. And if you're even thinking about living on the Space Coast, give us a call, shoot us a text, send us an email, or even send the pitching carrier. We're getting so many calls and we absolutely love it. So if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out. And if you want to learn everything about working, eating, sleeping, playing, living on the Space Coast, make sure you hit that subscribe button for our weekly videos. I'm Realtor Ben and I hope you enjoyed this video.